The text came in cold. "You're out of my life, Mom." Just as I unlocked the penthouse door with my own key. Still, I didn't call out. I just stepped in like any co-owner would. As my heels crossed the marble, their wine glasses sat waiting. Romantic. Naive. While his fiancée's perfume hung in the air, I slid the deed onto the counter, slow and silent. The same one that proved what he forgot. His mother's name is on every square foot of this place. That's when my son realized, you can't evict blood from the foundation. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen adjusted the receiver to her ear, her fingers tracing the edge of the coffee mug in front of her. The condo was quiet. A place of calm she'd built for herself after decades of hustling and taking care of everyone else. But today, the silence felt heavy. Grayson had called her about the water damage repair costs last week, and she'd been waiting for him to get back to her on the details. She'd been patient. Too patient, perhaps. But it was time for them to have the conversation, and she wasn't about to back down. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice immediately sharp. "Yeah, Mom?" Grayson's tone was clipped, impatient. Helen took a breath, steadying herself before speaking. "I've gone through the reports from the building's maintenance team. The water damage in the master bath is worse than we thought. It'll take about $10,000 to fix properly. I'll need your share to cover the repairs." "I've sent you the breakdown already." She could hear him sigh on the other end, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of irritation and the faintest trace of entitlement. "Why are you involved in everything, Mom?" He shot back, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and exasperation. Helen let the words sit for a moment before responding, letting him know that she wasn't backing down. "Because I co-signed the original mortgage, Grayson," she said calmly, choosing her words with the same precision she used in all her business deals. "I'm still financially tied to this property, and it's my responsibility." There was a silence on the other end of the line, so thick it almost felt like she could hear his thoughts unraveling. Then, Tina's voice, a quiet murmur in the background, cut through the air. "It's always something with her," she muttered, just loud enough for Helen to hear, laced with venom. Helen clenched her jaw, but she said nothing. Tina's barbs didn't cut as deeply anymore. She was used to it. The pettiness, the passive-aggressive remarks. Grayson didn't miss a beat. His voice sharpened, venomous. "You're out of my life. Permanently." The words hit Helen like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She had been expecting something like this, hadn't she? His resentments, his anger. He'd been simmering with it for years. "I'm done," he added, his words final. There was no room for negotiation, no space for the bond they once shared as mother and son. The call ended abruptly, the click of the line severing their connection just as quickly as their relationship seemed to be unraveling. Helen sat there, holding the receiver in her hand, a strange calm settling over her. She stared at the screen of her phone, as though willing the words she'd just heard to make sense. But they didn't. She'd always known Grayson had his issues with her, ever since he was a teenager, resentful of her work, her discipline, the way she'd raised him to be self-sufficient. He'd never been happy with her success. Not truly. But this felt like a line had been crossed. Permanently. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, just staring at the phone, when the soft ding of a text message broke the silence. It was from Riley. "I saw how he spoke to you. I'm sorry." Helen's chest tightened for a brief moment. She couldn't bring herself to reply immediately. Riley. Her granddaughter was the one light in all this darkness, the one person who still understood the sacrifices Helen had made, who didn't see her as a hindrance, but as a guide. "Thank you, sweetheart. He's about to learn respect another way." Helen typed the message quickly, sending it with a steady resolve she hadn't fully felt before. There would be no more retreating into the shadows of Grayson's life. He'd written her off, but she wasn't done. Grayson thought he had the power. He thought he could erase her with a few angry words. But Helen knew better than that. She wasn't a woman who could be dismissed so easily. She set the phone down on the counter and gazed out the window, at the city skyline that stretched out before her. The skyline that was hers too. Partly, at least. The horizon felt different now. The air outside was cooler than it had been in weeks. Helen could almost taste the change coming. The winds were shifting. A small smile tugged at her lips. She'd been told she was out of his life. But in the quiet moments that followed, with the weight of the phone call still hanging in the air, one thought echoed in her mind. He hadn't realized yet. She wasn't the one who had left. She was still here, and she would stay, no matter what. The fight was just beginning, and Grayson was about to find out exactly who was in control. Helen sat in her study, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The condo felt empty without the usual hum of her work, without the constant buzz of phone calls and meetings. For the first time in years, the only noise was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. She picked up the thick file in front of her, a file that had been gathering dust for months, if not years. Inside it was the original deed to the penthouse, the very one Grayson had tried to push her out of with a few harsh words. Her fingers moved over the paper with an almost reverent touch. The ink was faded in spots, the corners curled, but the legal language was as crisp and unyielding as the day it had been signed. Joint tenants with right of survivorship, the words jumped out at her. She'd chosen this language, back when Grayson was younger, when she thought they would be partners in everything. They had worked together to secure this property, invested their time, their money, their lives. And now it was clear. The legal bond was stronger than anything Grayson could say in a fit of rage. She exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair, feeling the weight of those words. Equal ownership, no matter what. Naomi's right, she muttered to herself. She thought of the many years spent in the courtroom, of the countless legal battles she had won, always with precision, always with an unwavering commitment to her principles. And this was no different. Grayson's tantrum meant nothing in the face of legal rights. A soft buzz from her phone interrupted her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Riley. Helen's chest tightened, the warmth of her granddaughter's loyalty always a sharp contrast to the coldness of Grayson's abandonment. Riley had a way of understanding what Helen needed, even when she said nothing at all. She opened the message. I saw how he spoke to you. I'm sorry. Helen paused. She ran a finger across the screen, her heart swelling in that quiet, unspoken bond they shared. Riley. At 16, she was already wiser than most people twice her age, but it was the tenderness in her message that hit Helen hardest. Riley had seen her struggle for years, had witnessed her push herself to build a future, to create something real, something that couldn't be taken away. And yet, for all the things Riley understood, there were still so many things about this world that were hidden from her. Still, the fact that Riley could see through the harshness of her son, to recognize the pain of that exchange, it made Helen believe in something greater than the ugly bitterness that Grayson had tried to sow between them. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she typed, the words coming easier now. Thank you, sweetheart. He's about to learn respect another way. She hit send and then leaned back again, the message lingering in the air like the quiet promise of a storm. Grayson was angry. He thought he had the upper hand, but Helen knew better. She wasn't some passive victim waiting to be thrown aside. She had built this life, and it wasn't just hers by right. It was hers by sweat, by sacrifice, and by unwavering will. Her thoughts turned back to the deed in front of her. As the weight of the paper rested between her fingers, she felt a shift inside her. The power she had thought she had lost with Grayson's words was still here. still as potent as the day she'd signed that document. She wasn't powerless. She never had been. The sound of footsteps from the hallway pulled her attention away, and she glanced up as Naomi appeared in the doorway, her face calm, but with a certain knowing glint in her eyes. Naomi had been Helen's legal advisor for decades, their friendship forged in the trenches of property disputes and estate planning. Naomi knew exactly what Helen was thinking, even when she didn't say it. "You've been quiet," Naomi said, her voice smooth, almost like a whisper in the otherwise still air. Helen glanced up, her lips curling into a small smile. "I was just going over the deed again. Grayson thinks this is over, but it's only just begun." Naomi nodded, stepping further into the room and pulling out her tablet. "I reviewed the paperwork again. As I said before, he can't sell, refinance, or evict you without your consent. Not with this agreement in place." Helen straightened, the smile widening. "Good. Then let's stop pretending I'm powerless." She set the deed down on the desk, eyes glinting with a sudden resolve. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "He'll be furious when he finds out you filed a dispute with the title office." "I want him to be furious," Helen replied, her voice steady and full of conviction. "Let him think I've given up. It'll make the next move all the sweeter." Naomi studied her for a moment before nodding, impressed by the fire that had reignited in Helen's eyes. "You've got him exactly where you want him." Helen didn't respond. She didn't need to. She simply stood up and moved to the window, her gaze falling on the cityscape below. The lights of Midtown Atlanta twinkled in the distance, a far-off glow that somehow felt like a beacon. Her beacon, one she was going to take back. She had been sidelined, dismissed, but she was still standing, still fighting. As she looked out at the horizon, a faint ding from her phone broke the silence again. This time, it was a reminder of something Grayson had no knowledge of yet. Helen had filed the paperwork that would change everything. He might have thought he'd pushed her out of his life, but the reality was much more complicated. Grayson would find out soon enough. And when he did, he'd have to face the woman who had always been more than he could ever imagine. He just didn't know it yet. Helen sat at her desk, fingers drumming rhythmically on the edge of her laptop. The city stretched out before her in the dusk, the skyline glowing with the last light of the setting sun. She should have felt a sense of peace in the solitude, but instead, there was an unmistakable fire simmering inside her. Grayson's words, his final dismissal, still echoed in her mind, but they weren't the focus anymore. She had a new target. She opened the email she'd just drafted. The document was a co-owner dispute, a legal challenge to the validity of Grayson's attempts to sell or refinance the penthouse without her consent. The title office had to be notified, the paperwork had to be filed. Helen knew this was the next logical step in the process, a small but significant move in a long chess game. But she wasn't worried about whether Grayson would realize it was coming. She knew that the element of surprise had already worked in her favor. Her finger hovered over the send button. She took one last breath, feeling the cool air of the evening seep in through the open window. Then, with a quick, purposeful click, the dispute was filed. The phone in front of her buzzed with a new message, and her chest tightened as she saw it was from Victor. "Grayson listed the penthouse for private sale, asking price is high, but it doesn't matter. His name's not enough. It'll get flagged in minutes." Helen smiled at the message, the thought of Grayson's arrogant overconfidence almost making her laugh. He thought he could just sell the penthouse on his own. He didn't even understand the fine print. But she did. A few minutes later, a second message from Victor arrived, this one less composed than the first. "Listing just came down. Someone flagged the deed. He's going to be furious. I just hope it's not you he tries to blame." Helen knew that the only way this would play out was exactly as it had to. Grayson thought his tantrum had solved everything. He believed he had severed all ties, written her off completely. But Helen wasn't about to let him sweep his responsibilities under the rug so easily. She quickly typed a reply to Victor, her fingers moving with practiced precision. "I'll handle it. He won't get away with this." There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that Grayson was still underestimating her. Helen leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. This was the kind of fight she knew best. The one where the power lay in the details, in the things no one else was paying attention to. And Grayson? He was too busy being angry to read the fine print. It wasn't long before a new message appeared on her phone. This one from Tina. Helen's lips curled into a wry smile as she read the contents. "I can't believe this. Grayson just saw the listing was pulled down. He says it's your doing. You've gone too far this time." Helen's grip tightened on the phone. She'd known that Tina would take this personally, would try to find someone to blame. But this wasn't about Tina. This was about Grayson's blind arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable. And now he was starting to feel the sting of his own carelessness. She felt a flicker of sympathy for him. He had no idea what was coming next. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Grayson. "You're still on this? You really want to do this the hard way?" Helen's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she set the phone down. No need to reply. The message was just more of the same. Frustration, fear, disbelief. She could almost hear him shouting through the text. It was the sound of someone realizing they were no longer in control. Helen had already made her move, and now Grayson was going to feel the consequences. He'd been too reckless, too certain that he could dictate the terms of their relationship, of their property, without consequences. But he had miscalculated. She picked up the phone again, looking down at the message. "You're still on this?" he'd asked. The truth was, she wasn't just on it. She was already 10 steps ahead, playing a game he had no idea how to win. A knock on the door startled her, and she looked up to see Naomi standing in the doorway, a knowing smile on her face. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Helen met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm not enjoying it. I'm doing what I have to do." Naomi's smile grew a little wider, her voice quiet but steady. "Well, it looks like he's not going to back down easily." "But that's his problem now, isn't it?" Helen stood up, walking toward the window and letting the last light of the evening fill the room. "It is," she said, her voice firm, "and he's about to realize just how big that problem really is." The game had shifted. Grayson had made his move, and now it was her turn to see it through. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Helen's eyes locked on the cityscape, her mind racing with the possibilities of what came next. The penthouse was hers, legally and undeniably. And Grayson was only now realizing just how deeply he'd underestimated her. He might think he had the power, but he was wrong. He was about to learn the hard way that Helen Foster was never out of the game, not by a long shot. The quiet hum of the evening filled the condo as Helen flipped through the thick stack of papers in front of her. She had always kept meticulous records, tax filings, loan documents, all the little details that anyone else might overlook. But not Helen. She had learned early on that the smallest numbers often told the biggest stories. She paused, her eyes scanning the page in front of her. The down payment on the penthouse, the $300K she'd put down herself, was right there, in black and white. Grayson had always taken her contribution for granted, assuming it was just part of his inheritance, part of the things she gave him without asking for anything in return. But that money, those hundreds of thousands of dollars, had been hers. She had earned it, sacrificed for it. And now, she wasn't going to let him forget it. Helen's fingers traced the line where the co-signed construction loan had been added to the ledger. Her hand lingered there for a moment. That loan was a symbol of her belief in Grayson, her faith that this investment would be something more than just a building. It would be a legacy. But now, she saw it for what it truly was. a way for her to ensure she had a legal stake in the property, a way for her to protect her interests if things ever went sideways. She wasn't blind. She'd always known how things might play out. Her eyes shifted to the tax filings, all of them listing her interest in the property. Grayson had never looked at these. He'd been too busy chasing his own version of success, too busy buying expensive cars and designer suits to understand what was really happening. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was from Naomi. "I've reviewed the documents again. This is airtight." He never read the fine print. Helen couldn't help but smile at the words. Naomi had always been the one to double-check the details, to make sure everything was perfectly in place. If anyone knew how to win a battle like this, it was Naomi. Helen set the papers down and picked up her phone, dialing Naomi's number without hesitation. "Everything's in order," Naomi said as soon as she answered. "Grayson may be furious, but he's in the wrong here. He can't touch your share." Helen took a deep breath, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the desk. "I'm not taking him to court," she replied quietly, her voice steady. "I'm just holding my half." Naomi was silent for a moment, then responded with a knowing tone. "You've earned that half, Helen, and Grayson will learn that the hard way." Helen's mind drifted back to the penthouse, to the life she had built for herself, piece by piece, year after year. She had never expected a thank you. She had never expected praise, but she had always expected respect. And she would get it, one way or another. A soft knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked up just as Riley entered the room, the soft rustle of her shoes on the hardwood floor the only sound between them. Riley, her granddaughter, was always quiet in the way she moved, but there was a quiet strength in her that Helen had come to admire more than anything else. Riley didn't speak immediately. She simply walked over to Helen's desk and looked at the papers spread out in front of her. It was clear she understood what they represented. "You earned it," Riley said, her voice soft but unwavering. "Don't back down." Helen's heart tightened at the words. In Riley's gaze, she saw something she hadn't seen in Grayson for a long time: loyalty, respect, love. Riley was the one person who understood the sacrifices Helen had made, who understood that this wasn't just about money. This was about honor, about showing Grayson and anyone else who doubted her that she would never back down from what was rightfully hers. "I won't," Helen replied, her voice steady. She met Riley's eyes, letting her granddaughter see the resolve in her face. "Not this time." Riley smiled faintly and sat down beside her, a quiet solidarity between them. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was everything. Helen's thoughts drifted again, this time toward the next steps. Grayson had no idea how much he had underestimated her. He thought the penthouse was just another thing he could take from her, just another asset he could manipulate to his own ends. But it wasn't just an asset, it was her legacy. And no matter what Grayson did, no matter how many times he tried to rewrite the story, she would make sure the truth stayed intact. Her phone buzzed again, and she reached for it without thinking. It was from Tina. "You really are going to hold your half? You're willing to drag this out?" Helen didn't bother responding. Tina's words were nothing more than a desperate attempt to make her back down. But Tina couldn't understand. She hadn't spent decades building her own empire, one brick at a time. She hadn't invested the sweat and blood into something that was as much a part of her as anything else. Helen let the phone rest in her hand for a moment, looking out at the skyline again. Grayson had thought he could bully her. Tina had thought she could talk her into giving up. But they didn't understand. They didn't understand that the value of what Helen had built wasn't just in the money, or the property, or the things they could see. It was in her determination, her spirit, her refusal to ever be dismissed. And they would learn that soon enough. As the sky darkened outside her window, Helen took a deep breath, settling into the calm that came with knowing exactly what needed to be done next. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was clear. Grayson thought he had the upper hand, but he was wrong, and soon, he'd learn just how much he had underestimated her. Helen Foster was far from finished. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow across the Atlanta skyline, when Helen received the first notification. It was a simple message, yet it sent a sharp twinge of satisfaction through her chest. Mortgage lender has frozen refinance application. Co-owner signature missing. She read it again, her lips curling into a smile. Grayson had been too eager, too confident. He thought he could proceed with everything on his own, convinced that the power he had over the penthouse would be enough to make all the decisions. He never bothered to check the fine print, but Helen had. She always did. She placed her phone down and leaned back in her chair, staring out the window at the city below. The lights were starting to come on, one by one, like stars slowly dotting the sky. It was a beautiful sight, but tonight it felt especially symbolic. Each light was a reminder of how far she'd come, how much she had accomplished, and how much she would continue to fight for. Grayson had underestimated the power of that little document, the deed that tied them both to this property. He'd thought his words had severed their bond, but he was wrong. The truth was, Helen's name was still there, embedded in the very foundation of the penthouse. No matter how much Grayson tried to rewrite history, the law was on her side. She knew he'd be furious when he found out, and she welcomed it. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She didn't have to look to know who it was. Naomi had been a constant throughout this process. The steady voice of reason, the one who knew how to turn every twist in the road into an advantage. Naomi had been warning her about the next steps, predicting exactly how Grayson would react. Helen opened the door to find Naomi standing in the hallway, her face composed but her eyes sharp. Without a word, Naomi stepped inside, her gaze immediately flicking to the papers scattered on Helen's desk. "He's going to make his move soon," Naomi said, her voice low but steady. "I'm sure of it." Helen nodded, sitting down in her chair again. "I'm ready for it." Naomi's eyes softened for a moment, then she handed Helen a thick envelope. "I filed the public notice of partial title interest, just as we discussed. It's official now." Helen took the envelope, holding it carefully in her hands as if it contained the final piece of the puzzle. She hadn't been able to file the notice earlier. She'd needed to wait for the right moment. Now, with the lender freezing the refinance and the public notice in place, there would be no turning back. Grayson's plans were already falling apart. Just then, there was a knock at the door again, sharper this time, more insistent. Helen glanced up, her gaze narrowing with an almost predatory satisfaction. "I'll get it," she said to Naomi, her voice steady. She stood and walked toward the door, her heart beating just a little faster. This was it. Grayson had come to confront her. She opened the door to find Grayson standing there, his posture rigid with frustration. His eyes were dark with anger, but there was also a hint of confusion, as if he still couldn't understand why things weren't going his way. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice tight. Helen studied him for a moment, feeling a strange calmness wash over her. This was the moment. This was where he would finally understand that his anger had never been enough to break her. "You removed me emotionally," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm still here legally." Grayson's jaw clenched. "You can't just keep holding on to this. You don't get to control everything." Helen shook her head, feeling the weight of the years of sacrifice, of silent support, of everything she had built. "You think I'm holding on to control, but you're wrong. I'm holding on to what's rightfully mine." Naomi stepped forward, her presence grounding Helen. "He may try to force a partition sale," Naomi said, her eyes flicking to Grayson, "but it won't work. Not with the notice filed and your rights secured." Grayson's eyes narrowed as the words sank in. His face reddened with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He couldn't believe it was happening. "You think I'll just let you take half of everything?" Grayson sneered, his voice rising. Helen met his gaze without flinching. She didn't need to say a word. Her eyes spoke the truth. "I'll bid," she said calmly. "Let him force a sale. I'm ready." Grayson stood there for a moment, frozen, his mind racing to catch up with the new reality Helen had just presented. But it was too late. His moment of control had passed. Helen stepped back, her heart steady as she held the door open for him. Grayson took one last look at her, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief, before turning on his heel and storming out of the condo. The door closed behind him with a soft click, the sound echoing in the silence that followed. Helen stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle over her. She had fought hard to get here, and now, for the first time, Grayson knew it. He knew she wasn't going anywhere. Naomi's voice broke through the quiet. "It's just beginning, Helen. He'll fight harder now." Helen turned to her friend, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Let him. I'm ready." As the door closed behind Grayson, Helen felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for herself, but for Riley, for the future she was building with her granddaughter. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to lose. The game had shifted, and Grayson had no idea what he was up against. Not yet. The silence in the condo was thick, almost suffocating, but Helen welcomed it. There was comfort in this quiet. It gave her time to think, time to reflect on everything that had led to this moment. She stood in the middle of her office, her gaze drifting over the room, a space that had seen years of hard work, the culmination of decades spent building something solid, something real. But it wasn't just this room that mattered. It was what had come before, the foundation she had laid, brick by brick, for Grayson's future. He had no idea what she had given him. Helen's fingers brushed against the dusty edge of an old box stored under the corner of her desk. She kneeled, pulling it out, the weight of it familiar. She hadn't touched these files in years. Inside were papers and receipts, records of the financial support she'd given Grayson long before he'd turned his back on her. Tuition payments, business seed funds, legal documents for the start of his first company. She had backed him in ways he had never truly appreciated. Her hand hovered over a set of yellowed documents from the time Grayson was in college. Tuition payments, always paid in full, without question. She had never asked for anything in return. And there, beneath those documents, were the early records of the investment she had made in his business, seed money that had helped him launch his first venture. She had been his silent partner, believing in him even when he hadn't believed in himself. But now, when she needed him to see the truth of their history, he was blind to it. Her fingers brushed against a few photographs, snapshots of Grayson as a child, the two of them at his high school graduation, at the opening of his first office. She remembered the pride she had felt in those moments, the joy she had felt watching him step into the world, knowing she had given him everything she could. Naomi had been right. Grayson had never seen it. And now, as she flipped through the records of her sacrifices, it felt like a slap in the face. He thought he could erase her from his life, but he was wrong. He had no idea what it took to build the life he had. Helen's phone buzzed, pulling her back to the present. It was Naomi, of course. "I've compiled a full dossier of the financial support you've given him. 25 years of documented proof. It's all airtight." Helen smiled at the message. Naomi was a godsend. She had always been the one to remind Helen of what she had built, what she had contributed. Together, they had collected everything Grayson needed to know: the proof of his mother's unwavering support, the documents that tied Helen's name to his success. This wasn't just about the penthouse. It was about showing Grayson that the life he had wasn't a result of his own brilliance. It was a result of her sacrifices. She set the phone down and let her gaze wander back to the files in front of her. Her heart was heavy with a mix of frustration and pride. It had always been this way with Grayson. She had given and given and given, but it was never enough. He had always taken her love, her resources, and never once asked if she was okay. But it wasn't too late. She wasn't done. The doorbell rang, the sound sharp and sudden. Helen stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans as she moved to the door. She opened it to find Victor standing there, a frown etched on his face. He was holding his phone in one hand, a screen filled with an image that made Helen's stomach churn. "It's Tina," Victor said quietly, handing her the phone. "She's trying to smear you online. She's painting you as the villain. But I took care of it." Helen stared at the screen, the words on the post barely registering at first. Helen Foster's greed is what's at the heart of this conflict. She's been trying to control everything even when she has no right to. Tina. Of course. The woman who had tried to drive a wedge between her and Grayson was now using social media to try to paint her as the villain. Victor's voice broke through her thoughts. "I posted the truth. Her narrative won't stick." Helen took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the phone. "You've done more than enough, Victor." "Thank you." He nodded but didn't leave. He knew this wasn't over. Helen wasn't one to back down from a fight. "Stay strong," Victor said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "She can't change what you've done. The truth is, with you." Helen met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I know," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "I didn't just help him. I launched him." She closed the door behind Victor, her mind already turning toward the next step. She wasn't going to be silenced, not by Tina, not by Grayson, and certainly not by anyone else who thought they could rewrite her story. Helen sat back down at her desk and opened her laptop, pulling up the file with Riley's schoolwork. The screen lit up, and Helen's breath caught in her throat when she saw the title of Riley's essay, "Who Really Built It?" Her granddaughter had written about Helen, about how she had been the one to lay the groundwork for everything Grayson had, how she had put in the work, the sweat, the love, while Grayson took it all for granted. Helen read the first few lines of the essay. Tears welled in her eyes as she saw her own life laid out in front of her through Riley's words. Riley understood. She knew. This wasn't just about a property or a legacy. It was about who had built it all, who had made the sacrifices, who had kept going when everything felt like it was falling apart. Helen closed the laptop with a soft click, her hands trembling slightly. She'd done it all. She had made it happen, even when no one else saw the work behind the scenes. And now, Riley would carry that torch forward. Her phone buzzed once more, but this time, Helen didn't reach for it. Instead, she smiled softly, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future. And this time, Grayson wasn't going to win. The fight had only just begun, and Helen Foster wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was cold, its walls lined with dark wood that seemed to absorb the tension in the air. Helen sat in the front row, her posture straight, her face composed. She had been here before, more times than she could count. The scent of polished oak, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of papers, they were all familiar, all reminders of the battles she'd fought and won over the years. But this time, the stakes were personal. This time, the person sitting on the other side of the table wasn't a faceless opponent. It was her son. Grayson stood across from her, his suit sharp, his eyes hard. Tina, perched beside him, gave Helen a look of barely restrained fury. They were trying to remove her, trying to strip her of the legal rights she had to the penthouse, to the life she had built. But they didn't understand. They didn't understand the history between them. The blood, sweat, and tears Helen had invested in not just the property, but in her son. The judge, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, sat at the bench, flipping through the documents in front of him. His face was unreadable, but the steady flick of his hand across the papers told Helen that he was thorough. This wasn't some quick, dismissive decision. No, this was going to be calculated. "Let's review the matter," the judge said in a voice that was calm but authoritative. "Ms. Foster has presented a detailed history of her financial contributions. You claim she no longer has standing, that her co-ownership is invalid. What exactly is the basis for this claim?" Grayson's lawyer spoke up, his voice smooth but desperate, as though trying to mask the panic beneath the surface. "Your Honor, we are asserting that Ms. Foster's involvement was minimal. Her name was on the mortgage, yes, but the contributions she made were limited. The property has since been under my client's full control, and her continued involvement is no longer warranted." Helen didn't flinch. She had heard this argument before. They were trying to paint her as a passive participant, someone who was just along for the ride. But they were wrong. They had no idea how much she had given, how much she had fought for everything they were trying to take away from her now. "Objection." Naomi's voice cut through the tension, sharp and steady. She had been sitting beside Helen, taking notes, her presence a silent but firm support. "The documentation provided clearly shows Ms. Foster's substantial financial contributions, not only the co-signing of the mortgage, but also a substantial down payment, business loans, and ongoing tax filings. To suggest she is not a legitimate co-owner is baseless." Helen felt a small flicker of pride at Naomi's words. Naomi had always been the rock when it came to this kind of thing, precise, meticulous, and unyielding in her belief that the law was on their side. And today, it was the truth that was on their side. The judge looked up from the papers, his gaze moving from Helen to Grayson, then back to the lawyer. "It appears that Ms. Foster has not only financial rights but also full legal standing in this case. I find no grounds to dismiss her claim." A deep, strained silence fell over the courtroom. Helen's heart raced as the judge's words sank in. It was done. They had lost. The case against her, the attempt to remove her from her own property, had been dismissed. Tina's hand slammed down on the armrest of her chair with a loud thud, her face contorted in frustration. The sound echoed in the stillness of the room, an angry punctuation to the end of their argument. "Your Honor," Grayson's lawyer sputtered, "we will pursue a partition sale. This will not end here." Helen sat silently, her expression impassive as Tina's eyes blazed with anger. She was seething, trying to control herself, but the anger was palpable in the air between them. Helen rose from her seat, her movements deliberate. She didn't need to say anything. The victory was already in the air. There was no need for a victory speech. She had been here before, and her silence spoke volumes. As she passed by Grayson, she could feel his gaze on her, hard, confused, and still filled with that simmering resentment. But it wasn't the same. Not anymore. He didn't have control anymore. Naomi followed her, her voice low but filled with quiet triumph. "You did it, Helen." Helen nodded, but her mind was already moving forward. Grayson would fight. Tina would make sure of it. But Helen had already anticipated this. The fight had only just begun, and she wasn't finished yet. Victor was waiting for them outside the courtroom, his face filled with a quiet relief as he stepped forward. "It's over, right?" Helen paused, her eyes steady on him. "It's just getting started." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You're not going to let it go to auction, are you?" Helen met his gaze, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Not yet. I have a better idea." The words hung in the air, full of promise and unspoken strategy. Grayson had made his move, But now, it was her turn to make hers. As Helen walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the day didn't feel heavy. It felt light. She had just won the first round, but it was the next one that would change everything. Grayson thought he was in control, but he was about to find out how wrong he was. Helen stood at the front of the penthouse, the tall, sleek doors staring back at her like the gates to a kingdom she had built and fought for. She had passed through them once before, with Grayson by her side, full of hope and expectations. That time, the future had felt open, limitless. But today, the door was a symbol of something else entirely, an assertion of power, a return to what was rightfully hers. With her key in hand, she didn't hesitate. She slid it into the lock, the familiar click reverberating in the quiet hallway. The door swung open easily. The first thing she noticed as she stepped into the penthouse was the smell of fresh air, the subtle trace of dust from disuse. The apartment was pristine, almost too pristine, as though it had been frozen in time. The vast living room, with its panoramic view of Atlanta's skyline, felt different now. Less like a shared dream, and more like a cold monument to the life she had helped create. The place no longer held the warmth of family or ambition. Instead, it felt like the space was waiting for something, or someone, to fill it again. Helen closed the door behind her, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She had every right to be here. She had a legal claim. Grayson's tantrum in the courtroom had been loud, but the truth was louder. She walked across the marble floors, her hand trailing lightly over the polished surfaces. The furniture, expensive and tastefully arranged, now felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who had no appreciation for the sacrifice it took to build this life. Her gaze flicked to the kitchen, a space where Grayson had always dreamed of hosting parties, of impressing friends with his new wealth. But the real work had never been his. He had been too busy with the show of success, never truly understanding the grind it had taken to get here. Helen had given him that success, one step at a time, and now she would take it back, piece by piece. She moved to the counter and placed the small envelope she had brought with her. Inside, she had placed a copy of the deed, proof of her co-ownership, as well as the judge's ruling from the courtroom earlier that day. Her heart tightened just a little as she slid them onto the counter. Each document a testament to what she had fought for and what she had earned. There was one last thing she added. A simple note, folded neatly. Still here. She had no intention of disappearing. Grayson might have thought that his words, his attempt to push her out, would be enough to erase her from the life they had built together. But she wasn't going anywhere. The message was clear. She was still here, and she wasn't leaving until the fight was won. Helen took one last look around the room before walking toward the door. She didn't look back as she left. Her heels clicking on the floor as she made her way down the hallway, past the grand windows that overlooked the city. The sky outside was starting to dim, the orange hue of the sunset reflecting off the glass. She closed the door behind her gently, but it was as though she had left her mark on the penthouse, something that could not be erased or ignored. Hours later, the penthouse door creaked open again, and Riley stepped inside. She had always known where the spare key was hidden, and she had been waiting for the right moment to visit. She had seen her grandmother's silent defiance, heard her say it in the quiet moments. Now, as she stepped into the place where her family's dreams had once felt like they could touch the stars, she knew something was different. Her eyes fell to the small envelope left on the counter. She moved toward it instinctively, as if drawn by some invisible force. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents with growing recognition. The deed, the judge's ruling, and the note. Still here. A smile tugged at Riley's lips. She had always known the strength of her grandmother's spirit, the quiet fire that burned within her. She had seen how Helen had kept things together, how she had made sure that Grayson, despite everything, still had a life to call his own. Riley knew now that Helen's battle was far from over. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about family. It was about respect. Back at the penthouse, Tina's voice was sharp, filled with that kind of irritation that could only come from losing control. She was pacing in front of Grayson, her hands flailing as she spoke. "She's mocking us, Grayson. She's mocking everything we've tried to do. We need to get rid of her, legally. We need to do something about this, or she's going to take everything from us." Grayson stood at the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes dark with frustration. "We can't," he said flatly, his voice strained with disbelief. "We can't do anything. She's still on the deed, and after today, it's clear. She has every legal right to be here." Tina slammed her purse down on the counter with a frustrated huff. "So what? We just let her win?" Grayson turned around to face her, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. He had tried to push Helen out. He had tried to take control. But now, as he stood in the penthouse, surrounded by the things that were meant to symbolize his success, he realized that everything had changed. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice hollow. "She's right. She's always had the power. We've just been pretending we didn't see it." Riley sat in her bedroom, holding the note in her hands, a small flicker of hope in her heart. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. Helen wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future. And Riley? She was ready to stand beside her. The phone call came a few days later, at precisely the moment Helen had expected it. Grayson, now backed into a corner, was finally reaching out for a lifeline. The legal battle had left him rattled, his confidence shattered. He had underestimated her in ways that were beginning to haunt him, and now he was seeking the terms he'd once believed were beneath him. Helen was seated at her desk, her fingers poised over the papers she had prepared in advance. The room was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of pages as she organized the documents. The penthouse, the heart of this entire conflict, loomed in her mind, but she had already moved past the emotional attachment. This wasn't about a property. This was about ownership, respect, and the power she had earned. Grayson would learn that lesson. The phone buzzed once, then again. She picked it up without hesitation. "Mom?" Grayson's voice was tight, anxious. "We need to talk. We can't keep doing this. I want to settle it." Helen leaned back in her chair, the chair creaking beneath her. She could hear the desperation in his voice. The hollow echo of someone who had thought victory was assured, only to realize that it had slipped away. "What do you propose?" she asked, her voice calm, measured. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of hesitation before Grayson spoke again. I'll buy you out. Whatever the price is, we'll make it work. Just tell me what you want." Helen smiled faintly, her gaze flicking to the stack of documents on her desk. The time had come. She had no intention of selling at market value, no intention of letting Grayson off easy. "I'll sell you my half," she said, her voice cool but resolute. "But it'll be at a premium, 40% higher than the current valuation." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "What?" Grayson's voice was incredulous. Mom, that's insane. You're trying to extort me." Helen's smile deepened as she leaned forward, pressing the button to put the call on speakerphone. She wanted to hear him squirm. She wanted him to fully grasp just how little control he had left. "This isn't extortion, Grayson," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "This is equity. I've held my stake in this property and I've earned it. You think I'm just going to give it up after all this time for the same price you paid? That would be the real mistake." Tina's voice suddenly piped up in the background, distant but clear through the speaker. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "You can't just hold us hostage like this. We're already paying for the repairs, for everything. Now you want more? Helen let Tina's words wash over her, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. The deal was already made. The question wasn't whether Grayson would agree. It was whether he was willing to meet her terms or not. Grayson's voice came back, filled with frustration. 40%? Are you out of your mind? This isn't a negotiation. You're trying to take everything from me. Helen remained composed, her voice unwavering. I'm offering you a way out, Grayson. A chance to keep what's yours without forcing me into a court battle. If you don't want to accept the offer, that's fine. I'll initiate a public auction, and you'll have to face the consequences of your actions. There was another long pause. Helen could hear the low murmurs in the background, Tina's furious whispers, Grayson's muffled sighs of frustration. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Grayson spoke again. You're serious about this, aren't you? I'm very serious, Helen replied, her voice steady. You can pay what I'm asking, or you can watch the property go to auction. It's up to you. On the other end of the line, Grayson was silent, but Helen could almost feel the weight of his defeat, the crushing realization that she wasn't bluffing. This wasn't just about the money, it was about her reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Tina's voice broke through the tension again, shrill with rage. You're ruining everything. This is our home now, not yours. You have no right to hold us hostage like this. Helen's calmness didn't falter. She had long since stopped caring about Tina's outbursts. You've been trying to remove me from this property, Tina, trying to erase my contributions. Now, it's time for you to learn how the real world works. There was silence for a moment. And then Grayson spoke, his voice softer now, tinged with desperation. What if I can't meet the price? What happens then? Helen's eyes softened just slightly. Then you'll lose it all. But it's your choice, Grayson. You've always had a choice. Grayson's voice wavered for a moment, a fleeting crack in the armor he had tried to maintain. I'll find a way. I'll figure it out. Helen's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. I'll be waiting, she said softly, her words like a quiet promise. She ended the call before Grayson could speak again, the sound of his breath still lingering in the air like a faint echo of someone who had thought they had control but had lost it all. Helen sat back in her chair, her hands resting on the table in front of her. She didn't need to gloat. She had already won. From the other room, Riley appeared at the door, her eyes searching Helen's face. What's going to happen now, Grandma? Helen met her granddaughter's gaze, her heart swelling with pride. What happens next is up to him. But no matter what, he's going to learn that respect comes with consequences. Riley smiled, a quiet understanding in her eyes. You're teaching him that, aren't you? Helen smiled back, a smile full of resolve and quiet power. I am. And as she turned back to the window, watching the sunset fade behind the skyline, she knew this wasn't just about property. It was about ownership, of the penthouse, of her life, and most of all, of the future she was building with Riley by her side. This was her moment. And Grayson was about to learn what it truly meant to lose everything. The check arrived a week later, just as Helen had expected. It was the full amount, 40% over the current valuation, just as she had demanded. She had let Grayson fume, let him stew in the consequences of his own arrogance, until he finally agreed to her terms. The ink on the check was fresh, crisp, almost too pristine to touch. It felt like the culmination of everything she had worked for, the final chapter of a story that had taken far too long to write. Helen sat at her desk, the check resting in front of her, her fingers grazing its surface. She could almost hear Grayson's voice, full of disbelief, asking if she was serious. She could almost see the look on Tina's face, desperate and furious, as if this was all somehow unfair. But it wasn't. It was justice. It was equity. It was the price of her patience, her sacrifice, and her unyielding belief in herself. She picked up the check and tucked it into a folder, then turned her attention to the next part of her plan. Grayson had wanted control, had wanted to push her out, but Helen had something far more important in mind. She wasn't just going to sit on this windfall, she was going to build a future. A future for Riley. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Naomi stepped inside, her usual calm presence filling the room. "You got it," Naomi said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of approval. "I assume the next step is in motion?" Helen nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "Yes. The funds are already being transferred." Naomi raised an eyebrow, curiosity lighting her features. "And what's the plan this time?" Helen stood and walked over to the window, her gaze lingering on the city below. The skyline was bathed in the soft glow of evening, and for a moment, it felt as though everything was aligning. The future was here, waiting for her to seize it. "I've opened a trust," Helen said, her voice steady. "For Riley. It's called Bright Future." Naomi's eyes softened as she took in the weight of Helen's words. "A trust? That's forward-thinking. Smart. She deserves it," Helen continued, her voice quiet with conviction. "I have spent my whole life working to make sure others have opportunities, but it's time to make sure that Riley has her own, without the weight of family drama holding her back. She's earned it." Naomi didn't reply immediately, but Helen knew that her friend understood. This was more than just about money. This was about legacy. This was about giving Riley the chance to succeed without the strings of resentment and bitterness that had tainted Grayson's success. Helen took a deep breath, her heart swelling with pride for her granddaughter. "The funds will go into 2 accounts, one for her education, one for housing. She's going to have everything she needs to build a life of her own without having to rely on anyone." Naomi smiled, a rare look of admiration crossing her face. "She's lucky to have you." Helen paused, her gaze lingering on the check in the folder. "One child wrote me off. The next one wrote me in." It was the truth. Riley was the only one who had never stopped believing in her, who had never treated her as an obstacle. Grayson had thrown her away, but Riley had always seen the value of her, the strength she had never stopped carrying. Later that evening, Tina found out. She always did. News had a way of making its way to her, whether it was through whispers or direct confrontation. And tonight, the truth about Bright Future, about the trust Helen had set up for Riley, was too big to ignore. Tina's voice rang through the phone, sharp and filled with venom. "You really think this is okay, don't you? Setting up a trust like that? You're undermining everything we've built. This isn't fair, Helen." Helen held the phone away from her ear for a moment, a flicker of annoyance passing through her before she brought it back to her ear. "It's not about fairness, Tina. It's about future. Riley deserves more than just a place to live. She deserves a chance to do more than just survive in this world." Tina was seething, but Helen could feel it, the desperation in Tina's voice. The realization that she had no leverage left. "You've gone too far, Helen. This isn't just money. This is our family. We'll find a way to undo it." Helen's lips curved slightly, a small, knowing smile that was both weary and triumphant. "You can't undo what's been done, what I've done. The future is already in motion, and it's not something you can control anymore." Meanwhile, in Riley's room, the email notification blinked on her phone, signaling a new message. She clicked it open and found the letter from her grandmother, explaining the trust, the future that was now set in motion for her. Tears welled up in Riley's eyes as she read the words, a sense of warmth spreading through her chest. The financial security was important, but it was the gesture, the belief, that meant the most. Her grandmother hadn't just given her money. She had given her the world. She wiped her eyes quickly, a smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, Grandma," she whispered. her heart full of a gratitude she could barely put into words. Helen had given her more than just a chance to succeed. She had given her the power to carve her own path in the world. As Riley stared out at the night sky, she knew one thing for certain. She would never take that for granted. And Grayson? Grayson would soon understand the true cost of everything he had taken for granted. It was a simple decision, really. After everything that had happened, after all the fights and broken promises, Helen knew exactly what she had to do. She didn't just want to reclaim what was hers. She wanted to make sure Grayson understood that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't take it all. She wouldn't be erased. Not now. Not ever. The penthouse, their penthouse, had become a symbol of the life she had built and watched crumble. It was a place where memories, good and bad, clung to the walls, to the furniture, to the air itself. But it no longer held the warmth of the family she had tried so hard to keep together. It had become cold and unwelcoming, just like Grayson's attempts to push her out. So she decided she would buy one floor up. Helen had always been practical, and practicality told her that if she was going to live under the same roof as Grayson, well, it would be on her terms. She would claim her space, not in a distant part of the building, but in the exact same tower, with the same view. A reminder to everyone, but most importantly to herself, that she was still here, and she was still in control. Victor had handled the arrangements quickly, as he always did. She hadn't even had to ask him for help. As soon as she mentioned it, he took charge, contacting the seller and arranging an expedited closing. No haggling, no delays. It was done in less than a week. The final paperwork was processed. The title was updated. No shared names. It was all hers. Helen Foster. She looked at the papers one last time, feeling the weight of them in her hands. She could almost hear the echoes of Grayson's disbelief, his desperate words that she couldn't do this. Well, she had done it, and now she was ready to make it hers. All hers. The balcony of her new penthouse had a view that stretched across the city, just like the one below. But here, everything felt different. It wasn't a place she had shared, or a place that had been tainted by Grayson's bitterness. It was hers. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the skyline, and she stood there, taking it all in. She had always dreamed of a space like this, a place where she could finally breathe without anyone trying to push her out. A place where she could be herself. No compromises, no apologies. She was free. Naomi had helped her with the details, decorating the balcony with flowers, hanging baskets of color that brightened the otherwise minimalist design. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt right. It was peaceful. It was a new beginning. Riley came by often, drawn to the space as much as Helen had been. The first time she stepped onto the balcony, her eyes wide, a quiet smile tugging at her lips, Riley turned to Helen and said, "This one's really yours, Grandma." Helen smiled back, her heart swelling at the sight of her granddaughter's admiration. "All mine," she said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction, and no apologies. The words felt final. They felt like a declaration, one that resonated deep within her. Grayson had thought that he could push her aside, that he could erase her presence. But he was wrong. The world was changing. And this space, this moment, was the proof of her resilience. That evening, Helen sat on the balcony, the soft evening breeze ruffling her hair as she sipped from a glass of wine. The city stretched out before her, its lights flickering on as night descended. She had worked so hard to get to this place, not just physically, but emotionally. She had fought for the life she had made, for the future she would give Riley. And now, as the soft sounds of the city hummed in the background, she allowed herself to take a deep breath. This wasn't just about the penthouse. It wasn't about the money, the fight, or the final victory. It was about ownership. Ownership of her life, of her decisions, and of her future. She had given Grayson everything he needed, and when the time came, she had let him go. But Riley had always seen her value. Riley was the one who would carry forward everything Helen had built. And as Helen watched the city below, she knew that in the end, her legacy would live on. The wind picked up a little, stirring the flowers she had planted in the baskets. They swayed gently in the breeze, as though in quiet acknowledgement of what Helen had done. She smiled softly, the weight of the past years lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, Helen allowed herself a moment of peace. As the city settled into the quiet of the evening, Helen stood up and went inside, her steps steady and sure. She had a future ahead of her, one she had fought for with every ounce of strength she had. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about living. And no one could take that from her. Down below, in the building where Grayson and Tina still clung to their imagined control, things were starting to unravel. They hadn't yet realized the full cost of their actions, but soon they would. Soon they would understand what it meant to underestimate Helen Foster. And when that day came, Helen would be ready. It was a simple decision, really. After everything that had happened, after all the fights and broken promises, Helen knew exactly what she had to do. She didn't just want to reclaim what was hers. She wanted to make sure Grayson understood that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't take it all. She wouldn't be erased. Not now. Not ever. The penthouse, their penthouse, had become a symbol of the life she had built and watched crumble. It was a place where memories, good and bad, clung to the walls, to the furniture, to the air itself. But it no longer held the warmth of the family she had tried so hard to keep together. It had become cold and unwelcoming, just like Grayson's attempts to push her out. So she decided she would buy one floor up. Helen had always been practical, and practicality told her that if she was going to live under the same roof as Grayson, well, it would be on her terms. She would claim her space, not in a distant part of the building, but in the exact same tower with the same view. A reminder to everyone, but most importantly to herself, that she was still here, and she was still in control. Victor had handled the arrangements quickly, as he always did. She hadn't even had to ask him for help. As soon as she mentioned it, he took charge, contacting the seller and arranging an expedited closing. No haggling, no delays. It was done in less than a week. The final paperwork was processed. The title was updated. No shared names. It was all hers. Helen Foster. She looked at the papers one last time, feeling the weight of them in her hands. She could almost hear the echoes of Grayson's disbelief, his desperate words that she couldn't do this. Well, she had done it. And now, she was ready to make it hers. All hers. The balcony of her new penthouse had a view that stretched across the city, just like the one below. But here, everything felt different. It wasn't a place she had shared, or a place that had been tainted by Grayson's bitterness. It was hers. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the skyline, and she stood there, taking it all in. She had always dreamed of a space like this. A place where she could finally breathe without anyone trying to push her out. A place where she could be herself. No compromises, no apologies. She was free. Naomi had helped her with the details, decorating the balcony with flowers, hanging baskets of color that brightened the otherwise minimalist design. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt right. It was peaceful. It was a new beginning. Riley came by often, drawn to the space as much as Helen had been. The first time she stepped onto the balcony, her eyes wide, a quiet smile tugging at her lips, Riley turned to Helen and said, "This one's really yours, Grandma." Helen smiled back, her heart swelling at the sight of her granddaughter's admiration. "All mine," she said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "And no apologies." The words felt final. They felt like a declaration, one that resonated deep within her. Grayson had thought that he could push her aside, that he could erase her presence. But he was wrong. The world was changing, and this space, this moment, was the proof of her resilience. That evening, Helen sat on the balcony, the soft evening breeze ruffling her hair as she sipped from a glass of wine. The city stretched out before her, its lights flickering on as night descended. She had worked so hard to get to this place, not just physically, but emotionally. She had fought for the life she had made, for the future she would give Riley. And now, as the soft sounds of the city hummed in the background, she allowed herself to take a deep breath. This wasn't just about the penthouse. It wasn't about the money, the fight, or the final victory. It was about ownership. Ownership of her life, of her decisions, and of her future. She had given Grayson everything he needed, and when the time came, she had let him go. But Riley had always seen her value. Riley was the one who would carry forward everything Helen had built. And as Helen watched the city below, she knew that in the end, her legacy would live on. The wind picked up a little, stirring the flowers she had planted in the baskets. They swayed gently in the breeze, as though in quiet acknowledgement of what Helen had done. She smiled softly, the weight of the past years lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in a long time, Helen allowed herself a moment of peace. As the city settled into the quiet of the evening, Helen stood up and went inside, her steps steady and sure. She had a future ahead of her, one she had fought for with every ounce of strength she had. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, and no one could take that from her. Down below, in the building where Grayson and Tina still clung to their imagined control, things were starting to unravel. They hadn't yet realized the full cost of their actions, but soon they would. Soon they would understand what it meant to underestimate Helen Foster. And when that day came, Helen would be ready. The invitation arrived on a quiet afternoon, slipping through the slot in the door like an unexpected breeze. Helen's fingers paused on the envelope as she saw Riley's name on the return address. She smiled softly, the familiar warmth in her chest tightening with affection for her granddaughter. Riley had always been so perceptive, so mature for her age. But this was something else entirely. She opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the thick, cream-colored paper. Her eyes scanned the letter, then widened as she read the words. "We are proud to inform you that your granddaughter, Riley Foster, has been selected to receive the prestigious Community Achievement Award for her essay, The Strongest Woman I Know. The award ceremony will be held next week, and we would be honored if you could attend as her guest." Helen's heart swelled with pride. Riley's essay about her grandmother, about Helen, had clearly touched the hearts of the committee. Riley had written about the strength of a woman who had never backed down, who had fought through adversity, who had built her own place in the world even when it seemed impossible. Riley had written about her. And now, her bravery, her resilience, her quiet strength was being recognized. The night of the ceremony arrived, and Helen stood in front of her full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of her simple, elegant dress. She had always preferred understated style, nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention. But tonight, she wasn't here to blend into the background. She was here to be seen, and she would do so on her own terms. As she stepped into the car, her mind flashed back to the courtroom, to the penthouse, to the years of sacrifice and loss. But she had reclaimed her place. She had fought for it. And tonight, Riley was going to show the world what that fight had meant. Helen arrived at the venue, a local hall with high ceilings and sparkling chandeliers, the scent of fresh flowers filling the air. She walked through the grand doors, a quiet confidence in her every step. Riley was already there, her face glowing with excitement, her eyes bright with pride. When Riley saw her grandmother, she hurried over, her arms wrapping around Helen in a warm embrace. "I'm so proud of you, Grandma," Riley whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Helen smiled and gently pulled back, cupping Riley's face in her hands. "No, darling," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." The ceremony began shortly after, with speeches about community leadership, perseverance, and the power of standing up for what's right. As Helen listened, she couldn't help but feel that the words spoken tonight were a mirror of her own journey. She had fought for a future, not just her own, but for Riley's. And now, Riley's words would immortalize that fight for everyone to see. When it was time for Riley to accept her award, she took the stage confidently, standing tall in front of a crowd that had no idea of the depths of the story behind her words. Riley smiled, her eyes searching for Helen in the audience before she began her speech. "I'm standing here tonight because of the strongest woman I know, my grandmother, Helen Foster. She taught me what it means to be strong, to never give up, no matter the odds. She's built a life from the ground up, not just for herself, but for those she loves. And because of her, I know that I can do the same." Helen felt the sting of tears in her eyes, the proud ache in her chest. She had given Riley everything she could, but it was moments like this that made it all worth it. Riley had understood, had seen the value of her fight, and now the world was seeing it too. When the applause died down, Riley made her way off the stage, the award shining brightly in her hands. She walked straight to Helen and handed it to her with a smile. "This is for you," she said softly, "for everything you've done." Helen took the award with a quiet nod, her heart full. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As the evening continued, Helen felt a familiar presence at her side. She turned and found Grayson standing at the back of the room, his eyes wary, his posture stiff. Tina was beside him, her face tight with frustration. "Mom," Grayson said quietly, his voice laced with a mix of regret and bitterness. "I didn't know you were coming tonight." Helen met his gaze with a calmness that almost startled him. "I'm here for Riley. I'm proud of her, Grayson." "I always will be." Tina shot Helen a glare, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "You always find a way to make it about you, don't you?" she muttered under her breath, her voice dripping with venom. Helen didn't respond. She didn't need to. Tonight wasn't about Tina, and it certainly wasn't about Grayson. Tonight was about Riley, about the future that had been set in motion long before this night even began. The ceremony continued, and as the evening wore on, Grayson lingered in the background, his frustration palpable. Helen could feel the weight of his gaze, but it no longer mattered. When the night came to an end, the crowd began to thin out, and people congratulated Riley on her award. As they walked to the exit, Riley turned to Helen and whispered, "You earned every inch of your view." Helen smiled, the words landing with the weight of all the battles she had fought. She had earned it all, every inch of that view, every step toward her future. As they stepped into the cool night air, Helen felt the sense of peace that had been eluding her for so long. Grayson and Tina might still try to rewrite the story, but Helen knew the truth. She had built this life, and she had done it on her own terms. And now, the world would see it too. The finality of it all settled over Helen like the weight of a storm cloud, dense and unavoidable. But unlike the storms of the past, this one didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like a cleansing, a necessary conclusion to a chapter that had taken far too long to write. Helen sat at her desk, the papers before her a mix of legal jargon and personal decisions, all binding her future into one clear, irrevocable path. She had planned for this moment, had thought long and hard about every word she'd chosen, every clause, every stipulation. Today, Naomi was here, sitting across from her, helping guide the process of finalizing what Helen had long known would come. Her legacy, the inheritance that would shape the lives of those who mattered. Naomi's calm voice filled the silence, her pen scratching across the paper as she reviewed the documents one last time. Everything looks in order, Helen. Grayson is removed from the will and trust. He's no longer executor. And Riley is listed as the sole heir, with the clause you specified. Helen's hands tightened slightly around the paper in front of her. It's done then. The words tasted final, but they brought no bitterness. This was the right choice. She had no regrets. She didn't look at Naomi immediately, but the two women shared an understanding. Grayson had squandered every opportunity to respect what his mother had built. He had turned his back, dismissed her sacrifices, and in the end, it was his own doing. Helen had given him everything she had, but he had refused to honor it. This decision wasn't born from anger, but from the realization that he no longer held the place he once did in her life. Riley will inherit everything, Helen continued, her voice steady but firm. I've added a clause. Kindness required. She won't just inherit wealth, she'll inherit the responsibility to carry forward what we've built and to continue living with integrity and purpose. Naomi nodded, her eyes softening with quiet approval. You've set a strong foundation for her. A good woman. A wise woman. She'll carry this legacy with grace. Helen's gaze turned to the framed photo on the wall, a picture of Riley as a child, her eyes wide with curiosity, her smile full of warmth. It had been taken on a day full of laughter, and the memory of it, of those simpler moments, still made Helen's heart swell with love. Riley had always understood her, always supported her, even when the rest of the world couldn't. The decision to name Riley as the sole heir had been an easy one. Helen wanted Riley to have everything, to be free from the constraints that had plagued her relationship with Grayson. The idea of Riley carrying forward her values, the commitment to hard work, respect, and kindness, was all Helen could ask for. She had raised her granddaughter to believe that family was more than blood. It was about shared values, shared strength. And Riley had proven that time and time again. Naomi glanced up from the documents, her voice quiet but filled with admiration. You've built something solid, Helen, something that can't be undone. Helen nodded, her gaze lingering on the final document in front of her. I have. And now, I'm ready to pass it on. A few days later, Helen stood in front of a modest building nestled in the heart of the city, the Women's Property Clinic. It was a space she had started to volunteer at, offering her expertise in real estate to those who had never had access to the kind of opportunities she had. She had always believed in the power of knowledge, in the ability of women to carve out their place in the world if only they had the right resources. The clinic had started small, but its impact had grown over the years. Now, women from all walks of life came here for advice, mentorship, and education in property management, legal rights, and financial independence. It was one of the few places that offered practical support to those who needed it most. As Helen walked through the doors, a young woman with an eager smile greeted her. Helen, we're so glad you could make it today. The new students are excited to meet you. Helen smiled, the weight of the day's work still lingering in her bones. But there was something about being in this space, something about helping others, that always made her feel grounded. I'm glad to be here. Let's get started. Victor, who had been by her side throughout much of her journey, was already there, setting up the room for a new workshop. His eyes lit up when he saw her. I've also been working on something else, he said as he approached her. We've got the donation endowment set up for the clinic, funds that will be used for future scholarships and development. Your legacy is going to live on through that, Helen. Helen's heart warmed as she heard the words. She had always known that one of the most meaningful ways to leave her mark was by giving others the chance to succeed. And through the clinic, through Riley's future, and through the endowment, Helen's impact would be felt long after she was gone. "Thank you, Victor," she said, her voice full of quiet pride. "This means more than you know." The following day, as Helen sat in the comfort of her new penthouse, she placed the last of the estate documents in a folder and added it to her desk drawer. There was something so final about it, about the decision to fully close that chapter. But it wasn't an end. It was a new beginning, a new phase of life that had already started to unfold. She glanced at the small framed document she had placed on the shelf in her study. It was a simple piece of paper, framed in gold. Her will, her estate plan, her future. It was the piece that connected all the threads of her work, of her journey, and of the family she had worked so hard to protect. Helen smiled softly, feeling a quiet peace settle over her as she looked at it. She had made her decisions. She had built her future. And now, she could let go of the past. The last chapter was complete. And the legacy? It was safe. Helen sat in her favorite chair on the balcony of her penthouse, a steaming cup of coffee cradled between her hands. The morning sun bathed the city in soft light, casting long shadows across the streets below. The skyline, her skyline, stretched out before her, familiar and yet still as breathtaking as the first time she'd seen it. It had been a long road, a hard road, but it had led her here, one floor above him, permanently. She took a slow sip from her cup, letting the warmth settle inside her. The faint hum of the city reached her ears, but it wasn't intrusive. It was life, steady and constant, just as she had always been. She had fought for this space, for the chance to stand tall in the very building Grayson had tried to erase her from. And now? Now it was her victory, her claim. Grayson had thought he could push her out, make her disappear. But Helen had turned the tables, quietly, methodically, until the world, his world, shifted beneath him. As she sat there, watching the world go by, Helen's mind wandered back to the last few weeks. The estate, the legal battles, Riley's award ceremony. Every step had brought her closer to this moment. And through it all, Riley had stood by her side, a constant source of love and strength. Helen pulled out the envelope that had been resting on the table beside her. It was from Riley, a thank you letter that had arrived in the mail the day before. She hadn't opened it yet, hadn't brought herself to read it, but now seemed like the right time. The paper was thick, the handwriting elegant and neat. As Helen began to read, her heart swelled with emotion. "Dear Grandma, I don't have the words to describe what you mean to me. You have been my role model, my inspiration, and my strength. You showed me that nothing in life is handed to you. You have to fight for what you believe in, and that strength has shaped me more than you will ever know. Thank you for everything you've done for me. I will carry your legacy, your lessons, with me every day of my life. You are the strongest woman I know, and I hope one day I can be half the woman you are." With all my love, Riley Helen closed her eyes for a moment, her chest tight with a mixture of pride and love. She had fought for this, for Riley, for the future they were building together. This letter, these words, were the culmination of everything she had worked for. It wasn't just about the money, the property, the legal wins. It was about the bond they shared, the future she was giving Riley. She set the letter down and looked out across the city again. The buildings, the people, the endless horizon. It was all hers now. But it was more than that. It was her family's legacy, carried forward by someone who truly understood it. The soft sound of footsteps on the balcony made her turn. Naomi was standing in the doorway, a smile playing on her lips. "I see you've read it," Naomi said, her voice filled with warmth and understanding. Helen nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the skyline. "She's everything, Naomi. She's all that matters now. I've done what I needed to do." Naomi stepped forward, her hands in her pockets. "You've built something solid, Helen. It's more than just a penthouse or a bank account. You've built a legacy, and that's something no one can take away." Helen took a deep breath, the weight of Naomi's words settling deep within her. "I know. I've spent my life building something, and now it's time to let go of the past, to move forward. Riley will carry it all. She's the future." The sound of a car door slamming downstairs interrupted their quiet conversation, followed by the sound of voices. Helen glanced down, her eyes narrowing slightly as she saw Grayson and Tina walking into the building, their heads held high, as if they still owned the world. A faint smile touched Helen's lips as she watched them. Grayson had tried to tear her down, had tried to erase her presence in the building, in the family, but he didn't realize the truth yet. "He said I was out of his life," Helen said quietly, her voice calm, almost wistful. Naomi glanced at her, a knowing look in her eyes. "And yet, here you are, one floor above him. Always." Helen took another sip of her coffee, her gaze following Grayson and Tina as they entered the building. They were still blind to the truth of what had happened. They didn't realize that it was never about the money, the property, or even the family. It was about respect. It was about legacy. And as Helen sat there, the sun rising higher in the sky, she knew one thing for certain. Grayson would look up someday. He would look up and realize that his attempts to push her out had only pushed her higher. And when he did, he would see her name, still written in the sky as it had always been, still standing, still here. And the city below? It was hers. No apologies, no regrets.